So in the social sciences, when we're thinking about measurement and concepts, we want to make sure that the measurements that we're creating and that we're using are good. What good means depends on a couple different criteria. And so we could talk about precision, how much fine-grained detail you're able to offer with your measure. But I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking today about this idea of reliability. So this is something that comes up a lot, and oftentimes reliability and validity are used sort of not necessarily interchangeably, but are sort of used in the same breath because they're getting at slightly different but related things. We want measures that are both reliable and valid. Reliable means that if we're making an attempt to measure something over and over and over, we're going to get the same kind of results. We're going to find the same kind of pattern that we don't have a sense of that this is volatile over time. Whereas validity gets at more the question of, is this true? Is this correct? Are we measuring things in the right way? And so I like to flag that a measure can be reliable, but not valid. And so if you ask me my weight, I will consistently tell you I am 5 pounds less than what the scale at the doctor's office says. So my measurement of you asking me and me telling you my weight is certainly not valid. It's not true or correct, but it is reliable. I consistently cite 5 pounds underneath the true weight. And so that's one way in which these things can diverge. But you can also have measures that are reliable, that are valid, but not necessarily reliable. And so I study conflict and civil wars, and we sort of know that we can think about the severity of war in terms of like how many people are affected and killed. But getting accurate numbers on how many people are affected and killed can be really difficult. The numbers that get reported in newspapers can be inflated or deflated, pushed down. There can be things that are not counted. There can be things that are overcounted. So it can be really hard to get numbers that are reliable, even though we know that if we had those numbers, they would tell us the thing that we're interested in. How awful is that conflict? So when we're thinking about reliability, there's a couple of strategies that we can use to maybe get greater confidence in the measurements that we're using. And so one strategy is just to use an established measure. Don't reinvent the wheel. Assume that if other people have been using a measure, that the problems with that measure have been scrutinized, that the problems with that measure are known, and you can find out. And in theory, most well used and vetted social science research methods should be reliable or valid, although I'll point out that shouldn't be taken for granted, that a good social scientist will always question the data and the concepts that he or she is using. And so, if you find that a measure actually is pretty terrible, maybe you shouldn't use it. Maybe you should do something else and develop your own measure. A second strategy beyond just, I'm going to borrow what other people have done and assume that they've, vetted things properly, is what we could call the split in half method. And so one way of thinking about this is if I was coding newspaper articles, I might want to keep track of the order in which I code them. And so then look at the first half versus the second half, because it might be that over the course of that coding, my own sort of internal definition about what I was looking for, or my attention span tended to wave. That would be one way to get this. When I was in graduate school, I coded tens of thousands of email exchanges involving negotiations between high school, middle school students. And I suspect that the reliability of my coding may have been slightly affected by whether or not the TV episode I had running in the background was what I had seen before or not seen before. We had other processes to catch when our coders were maybe not being as accurate as they should be. But I certainly know that my attention was more interrupted when I was doing something else. And that's something that potentially you could catch with a split in half method. If the attention of the rater or the person coding things shifts over time. Okay, test, retest reliability seeks to ensure that the same person will perform the same way at different points in time. And so again, this is getting at that idea that, at point A, if you administer a test, how will people perform? If at point B, you get a completely different result, well, is that a function of that person changing? They've learned something, they forgot something, they're in a different mood, or is it a sign that the test is actually kind of murky and subjective and doesn't give us particularly good results. And so if we consistently see that pattern, that whatever score you get the first time doesn't correspond to the score you get the second time, maybe that's a point of concern. And so I remember very vividly that I took the Myers-Briggs personality test and at one point online, and then like 2 days later I took it again and I was expecting to get the same results, and I found that I had like a completely different personality test. And that sort of, for me, kind of raised questions about reliability. Like my personality, I don't think changed that radically from point A to point B, but the results that I was getting from my measures did. And so what does that tell us about whether we should trust these measures or not? When we think about coding of data and turning sort of mushy qualitative data into more sort of data set kind of things or classifying things, oftentimes we're asking people, coders, to follow a set of instructions, to read through things or review things or look at things and apply what hopefully are directed but still subjective preferences, right? That a lot of these things do hinge on a degree of judgment. Hopefully we can provide guidance so that judgment isn't unreliable, that it's consistent. But there's two ways to think about that sort of consistency. And so one is intra-rater or intra-observer reliability, which means that if I show you the same message now, and I show it to you an hour from now, you're going to look at it and code it in the same way. So it's kind of like the test retest kind of strategy, that same person is going to have that same sort of subjective judgment about that coding process. We could also think about inter-rater reliability and inter-observer reliability, where we're looking at how I code things and how you code things. And if we're in fairly high agreement, that maybe suggests that our measurements are reliable. And so I mentioned before that I was coding these messages of negotiation styles. Well, I employed informally an intra-rater reliability test where I would go through the next day and I would spot check to sort of look at the messages and see, can I defend every 10th message that I coded? And if I'm looking at it and saying, wow, that doesn't seem strange, that caused me to ask some questions, maybe go back and re-scrutinize my coding. So intra-observer and intra-rater sort of reliability checks. The second strategy that we used was more formal and structured, which was that every message was coded 3 times. And then we looked at those messages across 3 different raters. And if there was disagreement, where 2 of us coded things as conflictual and 1 coded as assertive, that triggered a conversation until we had brought our coding into alignment. And so you can use the inter-rater reliability both to kind of get a sense of, are your raters sort of normed to the same set of rules, but you can also use it as a way of saying, okay, we need to fix these things because here are points of disagreement. And those conversations ended up being really useful in terms of developing better prompts and refining our coding rules and our coding procedures in a way that sort of produced more standardized results over time.